Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I would like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event with Kate Hope Day in conversation with Liberty Hardy, discussing In the Quick. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to the community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is this Thursday, March 16th, with Yaba Glay in conversation with Jamila Lemieux, discussing One Drop, Shifting Lens on Race. For regular updates on upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do on our website. To submit a question during the event, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. Also, support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click the green purchase button on the bottom of your screen that reads In the Quick. The link will redirect you to our website where we can continue your checkout process. We're selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. So a little more about Kate Hope Day. She's the author of If Then. She holds a bachelor's from Bryn Mawr College and a PhD in English from the University of Pittsburgh. She was an associate producer at HBO, and In the Quick is her second novel. A little more about Liberty Hardy. Liberty is a senior contributing editor for Book Riot and the host of the popular All the Books podcast. She lives in the great state of Maine, where she reads 500 to 600 books a year and hangs out with her 3 cats who hate to read. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Kate Hope Day and Liberty Hardy. Please enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie. Hi, Kate.
Thank you so much. Hi.
How's it going?
Pretty good.
I'm pretty excited to be talking to you about a book set in the future because I myself am in the future right now. I am talking to you from the future.
That's true. You are.
Not very far in the future, but it feels like something. So we're going to start off with a little reading. Would you like to give us a quick synopsis of the story or what you're going to read? And then we'll sit back and listen.
So I'm so excited that In the Quick is out in the world. And I get to share these characters and this world with all of you. The novel centers on June, a young, ambitious female astronaut whose life is upended by a love affair that threatens the rescue of a lost crew. And it's a book that sort of straddles literary and speculative genres for readers of both Station 11 and The Martian. It has adventure, mystery, a love story. It has a real focus on the sort of often uncomfortable details of living in space. But at its heart, it's the story of one young woman's persistence in the face of hardship and her journey to find where she truly belongs. And I'm just going to read from the first chapter. Space is cruel to the human body. We aren't machines, rockets with metal skin and polymer bones, rovers with microchips for guts. Our bodies are full of fluid and soft tissue. We aren't built for space. Our thoughts, the things we know, are sturdier in zero gravity, but they originate in gray matter. They change shape, even disappear in the face of disorientation, dehydration, oxygen deprivation. Because ideas require bodies too, hands, lips, a tongue, ears. Otherwise, they're about as useful as dust motes drifting in the air. When I was 12 years old and watched test rockets spark through the sky outside my Aunt Regina's house, I imagined their destinations. Perfectly round planets colored red and pink and white. I pictured spacesuits, puffy and bright against a black expanse. It didn't occur to me to think about the bodies inside those suits, the brains inside those helmets. Not until a frozen day in November, when the news came that the Inquiry Explorer was in trouble. It was on a 6-year mission, the first of its kind, to travel farther in our solar system than any manned mission had gone before. Inquiry was special. More than a decade of research at the National Space Program had gone into building the Explorer, and it was manned by 4 of the most talented astronauts in the world. It was a Saturday, late morning. I sat in the window seat in the living room with a book on my lap. New History of Energy. A chapter was devoted to my uncle and his famous fuel cell. The book smelled like him, like metal shavings and pen ink. Since he died, I'd read the chapter at least 20 times. I turned a page. Outside rockets launched from the NSP campus lit up the hard gray sky. The sound of the TV came from the living room. A man was talking about inquiry. I went into the hallway to listen, and my limbs went cold. The Explorer had lost all propulsion control, just as it was beginning its orbit around Saturn. The newscaster lowered his voice and began talking about the minutes leading up to when the Explorer lost power. He said its fuel cells were suspected. But that couldn't be right, because my uncle had invented those cells. I moved closer, my stomach a heavy weight. He didn't say anything more about the cells. Instead, he talked about the inquiry crew, and I grew impatient because I already knew everything about them, where they grew up, how old they were, what they had studied in school, if they had siblings and how many, their hobbies and what they liked to read. I could tell you every detail. I returned to my spot in the window and called the dogs, Reacher and Duster, to come sit with me, but neither came. I felt chilled and stiff and pulled my sweater to my chin. The words in New History of Energy swam on the page. I got up, went into the kitchen, and opened the closet door. Inside was my aunt's new vacuum, a sleek silver machine with a nozzle like a 2-headed snake. I used a knife to disconnect the nozzle, take out the screws, and remove the plates and filters. When I lifted the motor's cover, the smell of dust and paper filled my nose. The fan inside was a perfect plastic flower with curved gray petals and a small red center that made a soft clicking sound when I turned it with my finger. Clockwise and then counterclockwise. I imagined that when the flower moved forward, I was turning time, that night was falling all around me. Everyone was asleep and there was no rush. I could look at all the parts of the vacuum and think about how they could be put together differently, combined with other things and made into something new. I imagined that when the flower moved backward, time reversed, to before the news about inquiry, to before my uncle died, when he held me in his lap as he typed on his computer or pored over sheets of paper with faint blue pictures on them. I tried to imagine before that, further back than I could actually remember, to before I came to live with my aunt and uncle, back to when my parents were alive. But the flower didn't go that far. I will stop there.
That's great. I just have to say, I got a copy of this at the beginning of last summer, and I started reading it that day, and I just sat down and I read the whole thing, and I just love this book so much. And then I sat down and I read it again the next day and started telling everyone about it. And people were like, "Shut up, we can't read it yet." And I'm like, "I don't care."
You read it like the day it was available on NetGalley, and then you like told me, and I was like, it's such a weird time before everyone starts reading, and you're like, oh, so it's just incredibly grateful to hear from you at that moment.
So I'm going to ask you a question and then sort of a related question to this. My first question is where you got the idea for this book. And I want to mention at the very beginning, you list all these different definitions for the word quick, which I didn't know. I had never heard before that in the quick is an expression that astronauts use informally, meaning the final minutes before total oxygen deprivation. And I was wondering if you knew that going into this or if that was something you learned while you were writing this book.
I made that up.
I totally believed it. It was right there with all the other definitions.
You know what? It's a little, I will talk a little more about the inspiration behind the book, but for the writers that are listening, when I really don't feel like writing, I'll get out my Oxford English dictionary, which is the one that's the 2-volume, and it has the little drawer with the magnifying glass because the words are so small. And I'll just kind of I kind of asked myself, is there a key word that has to do with the book that will help me today? And one day I was thinking about the word quick and how June has this very like quick mind, but she also quick has this other meaning, when you think about the quick of your nails, that you can be kind of easily hurt. And she's also kind of like has this soft underbelly. And I had been reading all these space memoirs, and astronauts have some great slang for lots of things, but they didn't have slang for this thing that is sort of like the big fear of anyone that's living in space. And I got the idea that, well, that should be their slang.
That's amazing.
That was my little creation, but I can say a bit more about sort of where the book came from. When I was in the middle of finishing a revision of If Then, it feels like June just kind of showed up in my mind one day and started talking to me. And I was really excited about starting to write about her, but I had to finish this revision, and I kind of made a deal with myself that I could start writing in the quick after I finished this revision of If Then. So she was in my mind for almost a year before I ever wrote anything about her. And all that time, she was telling me things, and I was thinking of sort of whole scenes. And this was not my experience of writing my first novel at all. But by the time I started writing, I had just like this emptying of my brain. I had all these things in my mind. But if I kind of interrogate myself about, she just showed up in my mind, she has a very distinctive quality that shared a lot of my favorite characters in literature have this they kind of create hardships for themselves simply by being who they are, and you love them, but you're also kind of shaking your head at them. Jane Eyre is definitely sort of the quintessential example for me, but there's a lot of great ones. Lisbeth Salander definitely falls into that category. Arthur Less. We were just talking about TV before we got on. Fleabag, definitely. And it's characters that you feel so much for them, even as they're doing like the exact thing they maybe shouldn't be doing. And June had that quality from the beginning. And it happened that just as she's kind of showed up in my mind and started talking to me, my kids were obsessed with the Mars rovers and all things International Space Station. And we were watching a lot of videos of astronauts doing everyday things like brushing their teeth. That was the stuff my kids really wanted to know about. And actually that's really like sort of where my interests lie as well. That's sort of like, I want to know, like, how do they make a sandwich or whatever? How do they wash their hair? And those two things kind of came together because I had this character with this unique way of thinking about the world, and she would sort of take things apart in her mind and put them back together. And it seemed right that she would be kind of destined for this very, demanding job, both mentally and physically.
So did you feel a pressure to make the science in this book believable, or were you like, it's the future? Did you do a ton of research? Like, did you read, you said you read space memoirs, like were you watching videos? Did you listen to space noises? There's a lot of those in the book.
Yeah, I did listen to space noises, actually. There's a great archive of NASA various noises from various things, missions and things that they've listened to. I definitely was reading a lot. I read a lot of memoirs of people who, Scott Kelly's memoir of his year in space on the International Space Station. I read a lot of older, kind of fairly strange Russian diaries of, people's time in space. And I was just really trying to get at the sensory experience of what it's like to be in an environment like the International Space Station. And, the documentaries and the memoirs were great, but they weren't giving me, I really wanted to know what it felt like to be in a suit and sort of like what the controls felt like under my hands. So I did something very out of character, and I signed up to go to a space camp, which
That's amazing. That was my next question. I would love to hear about space camp.
yeah. So yes, adults can go. It is primarily a camp for kids, but they have an adult program, and I did that, and it was definitely choosing to do something that was out of my comfort zone. I'm not like a person who's naturally talented at like engineering challenges and things like that, and you do have to do quite a bit of that. And I'm definitely not someone who likes roller coasters, and you have to do some stuff where you're turned upside down and things like that. And the other thing is as a kid, I was not like big into camp. I think most introverts, I'm not like a huge fan of group activities. So I was hesitant, but I went ahead with it, and it was a pretty amazing experience. Long hours, definitely challenging, but we get to do all these simulated missions. And like one of them was, I was in mission control, and we had to keep this group of astronauts alive on the International Space Station. And we had these sort of binders full of actual, like, very close to what mission binders actually look like. And you just got a sense of like how quickly you can get in just deeply underwater. And it was pretty difficult. And in that mission, the astronauts did die.
Oh no.
We did not succeed with that one. We tried really hard to keep them alive. But I had a little more successful experience getting to do a simulated spacewalk. And I did get into like a real suit and sort of hear how loud my breath was in it. And I had the big kind of oven mitt gloves and the big boots and everything. And the way they do simulated spacewalks at space camp is they, similar to if you've seen Peter Pan in the theater, where they hang Peter from wire. So I was kind of right above this decommissioned NASA shuttle, the kind with the big doors that open. And I had to get from one end to the other and do this repair with this wrench that I had Velcroed to my suit. And so, they kind of attached the cord to me, and then I like pushed off, and then I just like was like a bug. When bugs are like turn on their backs. And I had to figure out how to move because my feet were not on. I was 30 feet in the air, and my crew members were down below, and they're like, wait, they're like, here, you can do it. And it was deeply embarrassing, but also like I went and I figured out how to do it. I sort of like swam and I did the repair, and I had just like this feeling of euphoria when I completed the repair and was able to like sort of swim back.
I mean, this novel, everything about it seems so real. I feel like I learned so much about space that I didn't know, like about how, June feels all puffy after she's been in space, and some of her parts feel bigger than others and smaller. And did you like write? Were you like writing and you're like, this is what's going to happen, and then I'm going to go back and check if this is factual? Or did you like stop every like 5 seconds to check the science first and then write it?
Yeah, that's sort of like the real challenge, right? When you have a sort of research-rich subject, you can really kind of like go down the rabbit hole and spend your whole day listening, reading about what happens to the fluids in your body when you're in zero gravity. So I did a lot of kind of pre-read, like I read quite a bit, and then I kind of put it away and focused. I mean, when I'm writing, I'm definitely focusing more on sort of like the emotional experience of the character and kind of where they're at and what their arc is for the scene or for the section of the book. And so I sort of focused on that, and a lot of details got, made their way in from what I could remember. And then I actually went to space camp after I already had almost a full draft And then I kind of went back in and tinkered with some things I actually got pretty right. I kind of drew from similar experiences. Anyone who's gone snorkeling, if you spent time underwater, there's a lot of kind of similar experiences that you can kind of draw from. Anytime you felt disoriented, you can draw from that. But I would sort of like gain more, and like with Space Camp, I would then come back and tinker with certain scenes, especially ones, the ones that I ended up working on a bit more with the added information from Space Camp were ones where it involved more than one person. Because the big challenge at Space Camp was not so much doing the building or, figuring stuff out. It was like communicating with other people. And that's sort of part of June's arc, right? At the beginning, she's really bad at communicating what's in her own mind. And then later on, she gets better at it. And so I did a lot of going back and looking at, the scene where Amelia and June are fixing, I think like the water pump or something. And, I went back and like, oh, this isn't actually right. I need to sort of tweak this.
Mm-hmm.
I love June. I kind of think of her as like a serial killer, but not of people, but she's always looking for like her next object. Like she's thumbing the screwdriver in her pocket and she'll like seems like she'll take apart anything that's near her if she can. She's just so curious all the time. And I love it. And I was wondering why you started with June at such a young age. And if you did any reading about child geniuses, or if you were drawing from your own life or your kids, or if this was something else that you had to read a bit about.
Yeah. I definitely drew from experiences with my own kids who have some quirks similar to June's. Maybe I kind of dialed it up quite a bit with June, but definitely my kids are very into building things and just sort of, at that age, kids just have a way of looking at something and seeing what it can be in a way that adults often, we're just so habituated to what things are. I don't think we necessarily have that impulse to think about, well, actually, this could be this other, this could be this or that. And I definitely drew from my experience with my kids. I think initially, I started with her at 11 or 12. I think originally I had her at 11 because I wanted to establish what this loss that she had in her uncle, and sort of start the book off with things being really hard for her. And that was part of the engine you were describing. It's sort of, she's always like looking for the next thing. And that's sort of like where that need, that sort of constant need comes from. It seemed like it was important to establish what her home life was and that she didn't really belong there. And she was in mourning for her uncle, and she wasn't surrounded by people who understood her or who got her or appreciated her mind or her way of interacting with the world.
So where did you get the idea for her inventions? I mean, she's got some great things, like the thing that goes up the stairs, and you can say you've done research, but that's like something from your brain, and it's incredible.
I mean, I think everything in there is probably some like permutation of something my kids have either drawn and said, this is a really good idea. Can I build this? And then you have to explain to them, yeah, no, I don't know how we would go about that, or that goes against the laws of physics, or, or whatever. But I think on the one hand, I definitely drew from my kids. On the other hand, I think I weirdly drew from the way I tend to think when I'm writing, which I think is visual and intuitive. And I tend to sort of like map things out in my mind and sort of take them apart and put them back together. So in that sense, June is solving engineering problems, which is so not what I do. But I do think that there's a certain kind of critical philosophical way of thinking that's where you're trying to figure out like why something is working the way it is working. It's actually shares something with what I learned to do in graduate school, which was, and analyze literature. And also I think what I do when I'm writing, which is kind of take things down to their component parts and then put them back together in some other way. And then I'll often like take them back down to their component parts and put them back together again, if that makes sense.
So much time with working on a hand, trying to get something to move like an actual hand. And I imagine that you spent a lot of time holding your own hand, trying to figure that out as you were writing it.
Yes. I think I got so fixated on that myself. And then that, obviously June also gets fixated on it. That seemed to me sort of like the perfect metaphor for why humans actually really don't belong in space. And so why it's such a difficult endeavor, because we're soft. We're not supposed to, be in that environment. And it takes a lot of technology and a lot of engineering to create the conditions in which we can be in that environment. But I think just thematically, I was interested in the idea of that tension between like the soft and the hard, and the vulnerable human bodies and the, machines that make it possible. And somehow like her working on that problem helped me work that out thematically in the book.
Mm-hmm. So before I ask you my next question, I just want to remind people watching at home that we are going to take some listener questions after. So you can put them right in that ask a question box at the bottom of the screen. So now June goes off to, basically it's like space Hogwarts. It's like Space Academy. She's younger than the other students, but because of her uncle, who is, the school is named after, she gets to go. And I love that, in most like future works, like books and movies, like space school or the future is like all very sleek and shiny and expensive. And in this, instead of the school being futuristic, it's the technology is amazing, but the school itself is shoddy. Like the living quarters are like a barracks and they're drafty and the food is terrible. There's snow all over the place. And then when they go to space, the same thing with like all the equipment, they're constantly trying to fix it. The hatch door is sticky. There are rats in the cargo deliveries and they're using duct tape to fix things, And I wondered if you thought this was like why you chose this imagining of space travel. Like if this is like something you've learned, like, yes, there's usually a lot of these problems, or if you were like, the government isn't going to spend this much money on space travel, so this is what it's going to be like.
I definitely am interested in the tension between what I think our archetypal idea of space, mostly from film, is of this future, everything is sleek and white and the astronauts are wearing like, either a pristine spacesuit or a uniform that, does not have stains on it. And I think the thing, the more I learned about what actual life is like on a place like the International Space Station, the more I got super interested in leaning into this sort of very realistic sense of daily life. And it is, things are always breaking up there and they are always having to fix what really constitutes, it's sort of like plumbing problems and like HVAC problems and cleaning vents, and things are always floating away and getting stuck in a vent and causing a problem. And just the amount of time that someone like Scott Kelly and his memoir, I mean, there's a lot of great details in his memoir. If you're looking for more of this sort of stuff, is just how much time he spends just trying to get a component to fit back into the slot it came out of, like 10 hours, whatever. And like trying to figure out like how a bolt, which worked fine when they took it out, suddenly doesn't. And just sort of the level of, it's sort of like everything has an added layer of both mental and emotional and physical difficulty because you don't have gravity, because you have, you know, a lot of things that are disorienting when you're doing actually a job that's like very similar to a job like that a plumber would do, or someone coming to fix like your air conditioner. And just the amount of time that's spent fixing things, cleaning things. And also, you know, the International Space Station is pretty dirty. It doesn't smell good. And it's really loud. There's a lot of beeping and whirring. And I was really interested in all of that and sort of what, you know, it just made me feel much more like I can feel what it would be like to be June in that environment. And so I really leaned into all of that.
So one of the things that we see about astronauts is that they're almost like these heroes, you know, like they're held up on a pedestal and it's amazing. They've been to space and, you know, little kids want to be astronauts. But, you know, something that you address in this book is that people are, you know, they have problems and people freak out and they don't get along and, you know, and they make a lot of mistakes no matter what job they're doing, you know, whether they're a doctor or, you know, like an astronaut. And I was wondering if you thought that this is something that happens more often than we realize, and that's just not like a side of it that we see, or if it's like we hear more about it now because of memoirs, maybe.
This is something I've been interested in actually for a while. When I was in graduate school, I studied the history and philosophy of science as in addition to the novel. And so I got very interested in this question of sort of how the story of science gets told and sort of how that matches up with the reality of, you know, how discoveries happen. And there's this kind of almost like mythologizing of how, you know, big discoveries happen. And it usually involves a man and it usually doesn't detail, you know, the story doesn't usually detail the collaboration that was involved. And also just like the mind-numbing, boring day-to-day work of science, all that kind of gets smoothed away. And we hear this sort of like myth of the single thinker who like comes upon an epiphany or who discovers something alone, you know, in their lab, and just sort of how the tension between that and the way science actually works in real life. And now I don't remember what your question was. I lost the thread.
People like freak out and like make mistakes all the time.
Yeah. And I think we often lose track of when you only celebrate like the big successes, you lose track of all the little tiny mistakes and also some of the really big mistakes. I mean, NASA has a very interesting and long history of mistakes. And just sort of, you know, how does it change the narrative of science if we incorporate an understanding of what the day-to-day nitty-gritty, you know, not always glamorous or not always inspiring parts of science.
So I'm going to switch it up and ask you a little bit about the writing in the book. So when I read this book, there's like rocket launches and explosions and fires and, you know, all kinds of accidents, but I still felt like this almost like serene feeling when I was reading it, and like almost, and I mean this in the nicest way, all of it felt kind of like subdued still, like all the tension and the drama stayed together really well, and I just felt like really calm when I was reading it. And then when I read it again, I realized you don't have quotation marks on the dialogue.
That is true.
You do in if then, and I was wondering if it was intentional, and why you chose to do it differently this time.
Yes, and I know for some people feel strongly that they do not enjoy that, but it was it was a choice I made as I was writing. I think I was in first person. As you know, If Then is this multi-point of view novel, and so I was popping in and out of points of view with four characters, and it was written in like a close third, but a third person. But within the quick, I really was writing it as if June was telling me the story, and I was in that just this very interior mode. And I think June is a character who's not great, especially in the beginning, at incorporating other people's ideas or thinking about what other people might be going through. She's not a person who's great at that in the beginning. And still maybe not great, super great at it at the end, although a little better. And just this sense of a character who kind of a little bit has blinders on. She like knows what she wants to do, and she has this need, but she's not like paying a whole lot of attention to everything else that's going on around her. And it just felt right to me that everything would kind of be filtered through her mind and her interior thought process. I also, I just had this feeling that the book needed to feel very clean, even as it was describing these very kind of nitty gritty details. That felt right to me. And part of that is part of the no quotation marks. It made the prose feel cleaner to me on the page.
Now, is the end result very similar to your original idea, or is it, vastly different? And is there anything that you cut from the book that you really wanted to keep, but you just couldn't justify keeping it, or it just didn't seem to work, but you're still like, oh, I wish I still had that?
The book is largely what I imagined in terms of world, character. The Pink Planet was an idea that came in midway. I wanted to have some scenes on another planet, and I thought about the moon and I thought about Mars, and I got like too caught up in the sort of like authentic questions, the scientific questions of what that would look like. And I got to the point where I was like, I need this to mean something to June. And it's an emotional, the planet has emotional meaning for her. She associates it with her uncle. She, when she actually gets there, it's sort of the place where she kind of comes into her own and figures out how to really communicate with another person. And in the end, it's kind of like the place that she most belongs. So that was something that I kind of kept changing, and eventually just came to, okay, this needs to be emotionally important, and it doesn't actually need to be a real planet. There's definitely a lot of scenes. I don't know if anyone from my critique group is watching right now, but I got very into writing the school scenes. Like it could have been like a whole book about the school. And so all the her friends in her materials lab, they kind of had arcs. There was like a love thing. There was a great scene where they stopped doing what they were supposed to be doing in one of their classes, and they turned on music and started dancing. And I loved that scene. And at a certain point, the members of my weekly critique group were kind of like, yeah, this is great, but what does it have to do with what's going on with June? And I was like, you're right. So mostly everything, there's not a lot of deleted scenes except for that section where I just kind of got interested in the side characters.
It kind of turned into like Space Breakfast Club.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I read this article with Ann Tyler several years ago, and she said, wonderful author Ann Tyler has like 25 novels now. She said that she often thinks about the characters in each of her novels still and wonders like what they're doing now after their story ended. And she thinks about them all the time still. And I was wondering, I'm trying not to give any spoilers about how the book ends, but so I was asked, do you think about what June's life is like after the book ended?
Yes. I have to say, this has been a different experience for me with this book as opposed to my first novel. And we were talking about this a little bit before we got on live. With my first book, maybe because that book went through so many revisions and I was kind of learning how to write a novel as I was writing it. When that book got turned into my editor, I was totally fine to be done with those characters. first I was like, they're adults. I think maybe because they were all adults, they, they'll be fine. I don't think about them a whole lot, but maybe because June, we meet her at the beginning and she's, younger and she does share some qualities with my kids. She still is around in my mind. I do think about her and I do feel protective of her in a way that I really didn't with my first novel. And I do think about where she is and what she might have achieved, not to give anything away, and just sort of what the next chapter would look like for her. And I miss hanging out with her. I miss like listening to what she has to say, and the other characters too.
Yeah. So you mentioned the differences like in the characters writing the two books, and normally I would ask authors like what's the experience like having your first book out as compared to your second, but we are in a set of circumstances that are very different than when most people have had their second books out until this last year. And so what is it like having a pandemic release?
I mean, that part is definitely weird. I traveled a lot with my first book and I did a lot of events, like maybe 30 events. Okay. And the thing that I'm really missing is getting to meet booksellers and hearing I just always got like the best recommendations and would leave with a pile of books, and always bring home books for my kids. And I miss that part a lot. And obviously talking with readers, I'm more introverted, so this is less disruptive. That's for sure. I mean, I've actually been able to write like here and there in between events, and that really wasn't happening last time. So there's some silver linings. I will say just in general, I'm not sure I really stopped and enjoyed myself last time around because everything is new and you're not really sure what's important to pay attention to and what's not important to pay attention to with your first book. And it just, everything feels very, a lot extra. And this time I'm just actually trying to enjoy the parts that I, really do enjoy and just, soak it up. But that's sort of like the pandemic, right? It's sort of anything that's good. You're just like, yes, I will bask in the goodness of this thing.
So you've mentioned, I think twice now, that you are introverted. So I'm not sure what your answer is going to be to this next question. If you had the opportunity to travel to space, would you take it?
Oh, I mean, I would really love to, but I feel that I'm constitutionally not suited to it. That was one thing I took away from space camp, I think, is just how bad of an astronaut I would be. On the one hand, I'm not the whole needing to be around other people constantly for like months on end. That would definitely be difficult. And the just not having like a strong stomach for various physical challenges that would be involved in that. The only thing I would say is that, being in space, just having spent time in memoirs and watching documentaries and doing space camp, being in space requires sometimes like this brute grit your teeth and bear it kind of persistence. And I mean, there's a little bit of that involved in writing a novel. So I will say, I do think I have that bit, but none of the other stuff that you need.
Well, I mean, I just saw the other day, there's like a Japanese businessman who is putting together like an 8-person like civilian team to go to space, which just, spending all that time with strangers just sounds like a bad idea. Like that's how people get eaten, like it doesn't, like that doesn't sound very smart to me, but I guess you probably have to go through the same training and all that stuff. So we have a question from viewers, and I want to remind you, if you have a question, you can put it in this box down here. I'm going to ask this question, and then I like to close with a couple of questions that have nothing to do with anything that we talked about tonight. So I'll ask you those after I ask you, what's the question? Kate, what was the hardest scene to write in the book?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, like every novel, I'm sure the writers in the audience will understand, the first chapter was rewritten so many times. But other than that one, I think there's a scene towards the end where it's like an ensemble scene where her crew comes together and they're in the sort of reconditioned explorer endurance, and they haven't seen, these characters have not been in the same room with each other for many years, many of them. And just figuring out like what, it's also the end of the book. So it's no time for them to like have a chat. You know, it's like the book was speeding up at that point and I needed to like draw the threads in, not like create more threads. So just sort of figuring out like where people would be physically in that scene, and also just like keeping focus on like what's the most important thing for them to say at this moment and not kind of like go off on these tangents. That was definitely a challenging one. I think, you know, beginnings and ends are definitely some of the parts of a novel that you will write over and over again.
So Anna would like to know, did you always know that you wanted to work with echoes of Jane Eyre, or was that something that came later in the writing process?
That really was there from the beginning. I think this character started talking to me and it seemed to me like she was a whole lot like Jane Eyre. And then I sort of at one of my other events, one of my critique partners, Lindsay Lee Johnson, reminded me that very early on, I had said to her, would it be a really bad idea to write a book that was like Jane Eyre in space? And she said, no, that's a fabulous idea. But I think it took me like a good 30,000 words to figure out if it was a good idea or a bad idea.
It's a great idea. It's fantastic. And Rachel would like to know, how would you define your overall writing process? Are you character-driven first or plot-driven?
I'd say I am character-driven, although I will say with both books, there's a certain concept that was the driving force very early on with If Then, the idea of the counterfactual and sort of this idea that you can think up alternative to your own life. It really started with that idea and the characters who might be in that headspace. And then within the quick, I was really interested in this idea of the tension between, you know, humans and space. And very early on, it seemed like June was the right character to explore that. And I wasn't even entirely sure why that was. That was just sort of like an intuition. So I'd say that as I'm writing, I'm definitely character driven, but usually there's an idea, concept, a kind of question that's there very early on. And it's almost like I'm writing scenes to try to like figure that out and answer that question for myself or answer that question for the characters. I will say I definitely, if the question is like the plotter versus pantser question, I think my natural mode is to write something that's very, very free write for about 40,000 words before I do any plotting. And that's the point at which I can't deal with the mess any longer. And I stop and I do some like actual structural, figure out like, this is plot point 1, this is plot point 2. And then I kind of go back and make that big mess of, what I've forced myself not to revise or edit. I start turning it into chapters.
So before we bring Maggie back, I'm going to ask you a couple of silly questions.
Go for it.
It's a fun way to end, My first one is, if you could only eat one thing for the rest of your life, what would it be? Is it the turkeys in the backyard?
There's a dog trying to get in right there. Not my dog. I wouldn't eat her. Oh gosh, that's really hard. I mean, I think if it was a drink, I'd have to say coffee, but if it's something to eat, I have to say some form of pasta or noodles.
That's a great answer. I mean,
yeah,
that's a fun answer. And who is your favorite Muppet?
Oh, I mean, I'm not sure what this reveals about me, but definitely Miss Piggy.
Oh my goodness! So you are the fourth author in a row to say Miss Piggy. I've been doing a bunch of these events lately, and Miss Piggy is like having it's her renaissance. I mean, everybody's all about Miss Piggy lately. It's very funny.
I feel like she knows what she wants, and she says it.
Yeah, aggressively sometimes, but you know, she's the woman who goes after what she wants. Okay, I love your book so much. I thank you for writing it. I thank you for letting me come here and ask you questions, silly and non-silly. And Maggie's gonna come back now and sing us out, or dance us out, or the hook maybe.
Hi. Okay. I think my favorite Muppets are Statler and Waldorf, the two old men.
Oh yeah, that's a strong choice as well.
They're they're the best. Okay, so that's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you so much to our guests and for those who tuned in this evening. We really appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click the green purchase button that reads in the quick directly below the viewer screen. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Maggie. Thanks, everyone. Shop local, shop your independent local bookstore.